This is going to sound weird, but bear with me. When I was in high school, there was a kid who told everyone he was a demon. I don't feel comfortable even writing his name for reasons you'll soon understand. I'm just going to call him Patrick, even though his name sounds like something out of a Shakespeare play. He was extremely socially awkward and walked around with a super empty stare that made even teachers uncomfortable. He wore the same blank gray hoodie literally every single day. I'm not exaggerating. I'm pretty sure he never washed it, since he always smelled terrible too. He was decently short and pretty average looking, although you wouldn't be able to tell since he always had his hood up. He never took his sunglasses off, even inside. Teachers eventually stopped asking him to because he would never listen anyway. Now comes the weird stuff. He didn't have any friends, but he had this weird tendency to adopt people. I mean by that, if he liked you, which he could decide randomly one day, he would walk up to you and say you were adopted, meaning you were part of his circle or whatever. Apparently, this would make you safe from him or something. That's at least what he'd say about it. He didn't really like that many people though, so few people were ever really adopted. I was one of those few. Looking back, it was probably because he had a crush on me. None of us believed his demon spiel, and everyone just assumed he was a troubled kid, which he definitely was. Oh yeah, I should probably mention that this all takes place in Wayne, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. Another girl I used to be friends with, Gabby, had also been adopted by him. Patrick's crush on her was a little more obvious, and all my friends knew it. One day, my friends and I were chilling on the dugouts behind our high school, killing time and doing God knows what. It was me, Gabby, Laura, and Luke. I can't exactly remember how it happened, but the topic of conversation flowed over to Patrick's crush on Gabby. We were all laughing about it, and Gabby was pretty obviously embarrassed. I can't remember what it was, but there was a nickname we'd substitute for Patrick's name because his real name was too clunky. This time though, I distinctly remember Laura using Patrick's real name. The third time she said it, I swear in my life that Patrick appeared out of nowhere and jumped on top of the dugout with a baseball bat in his hand. It wasn't scary in a typical sense, but it was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen up until that point. We quickly stopped talking, nervous that he might have overheard us talking about him. He didn't say anything though and just stared at us. I gave him a little wave, and he nodded in acknowledgement at me before jumping back down to the ground and swiftly walking away. After we were sure he was gone, the four of us burst into laughter, finding humor in how weird the whole encounter was. On the inside though, I was still a little disturbed. The next incident I can remember was significantly more creepy and impossible to laugh about. I was literally in Laura's house, and the two of us were hanging out in her room. Her parents were home. I'm not sure what exactly we were talking about, but again, Patrick's name was said 3 times between the two of us. Not 10 minutes later, we heard Laura's front door slam shut. Confused, we went downstairs to see if one of our other friends had decided to pull up. Laura was friends with everyone, and her parents were super chill, so people came and went unannounced when it came to her house. Laura's mom had beaten us to the door though. We turned the corner of the living room and stared in shock at Patrick, who was just standing there talking to Laura's mom. She asked him what he was doing there, to which he literally replied, "I was summoned." Laura's mom made some small talk with him before politely asking him to leave, which he silently did. The reason why more alarm bells weren't going off was because Laura's mom actually knew Patrick and liked him. Laura and I weren't as calm about the situation though. As we walked back up the stairs, we talked to each other with horrified faces about how creepy that was. A few minutes later, we made the connection between the two events. He seemed to pop up when his name was uttered 3 times. I know how ridiculous this sounds, but we had both witnessed 2 unexplainable events and knew Patrick's history of claiming to be a demon. How else could someone else rationalize what had taken place? We told all of our friends about the incident the next day, and our friend group swore to never say his name 3 times in one conversation again. Things were going well for a few months, and I started to think that maybe I had overreacted. That is, until one day when my same group of friends were hanging out at my other friend Johnny's house. We were chilling on his back deck when the topic of conversation again found itself concerning Patrick. Despite all of our efforts to convince him, Johnny refused to believe what we told him about Patrick. Even after confirming the story with the entire group, he was still skeptical. To display his disbelief, he jokingly used Patrick's name 3 times in the same sentence. To our dismay, when nothing happened, he grinned and told us we were stupid to believe something so ridiculous. As annoyed as I was, part of me was relieved that he hadn't shown up. I spoke too soon though, because a few minutes later, Patrick jumped over Johnny's backyard fence. Johnny noticed him first and stopped speaking mid-sentence. The rest of us followed suit and went dead silent, nervous about what Patrick might do this time. We watched as he stared at us for a few seconds before jumping back over the fence and disappearing out of sight. Johnny started freaking out and accused us of conspiring with Patrick to scare him. We told him that we literally begged him not to say anything. We sat in silence for a while before Johnny eventually told us all to go home, clearly shaken from the experience. The last experience I had concerning Patrick was definitely the scariest and most disturbing. It was the only one where I felt like my life might have actually been in danger. A few months after the incident at Johnny's house, I was home alone one night. My parents rarely left the house back then, so this was a rare occurrence. I decided to take advantage of the situation and invited a boy over whom I'd been talking to. He was kind of a tool, but so were most of the guys I was talking to at that age. We were hanging out in my room, and it was lightly raining outside. After a while, he mentioned something about Patrick, which made me visibly cringe. He got confused, so I explained the situation to him. He burst out laughing and told me he was going to say Patrick's name to scare me. I begged him not to, but he did it anyway. Only this time, he didn't just say it, he literally screamed Patrick's name 3 times at the top of his lungs. There was no delay this time. The moment he finished yelling, I could hear the rain instantly pick up outside. A few seconds later, there was a flash of lightning. I started to freak out. The guy I was with actually seemed sorry and told me it was probably just an extremely unlikely coincidence. I cursed him out and ran to my window to look at the storm. I glanced down to look at my driveway and screamed when I saw a silhouette of a person looking up at my window. It was too dark and stormy to know for sure, but I was 99% certain that it was Patrick. I shut the blinds and rushed downstairs to make sure all the doors were locked. After locking the back door, I saw that person again, only this time he was standing motionlessly in my front yard. I felt a panic attack coming on, and I knew Patrick was going to find a way inside my house. I started screaming, "I'm adopted," over and over again, hoping that would do something. I know there was no way he'd have been able to hear me, but my brain was all over the place at that point. The guy I was with ran down the stairs a few seconds later and picked me up off the kitchen floor in an attempt to comfort me. I looked out the window again, and he was gone. The storm was still coming down like crazy though, but it's not like I was going to search the property anyway. We watched as he stared at us for a few seconds before jumping back over the fence and disappearing out of sight. Johnny started freaking out and accused us of conspiring with Patrick to scare him. We told him that we literally begged him not to say anything. We sat in silence for a while before Johnny eventually told us all to go home, clearly shaken from the experience. The last experience I had concerning Patrick was definitely the scariest and most disturbing. When I was 19, I worked as an Uber driver. I hadn't figured out what I wanted to do with my life yet, so I hadn't started college or anything. I was just doing Uber to pay my bills until I could figure it all out. This night, I was driving from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., or at least that was my plan. Most other drivers weren't working around those times, and I was always more of a night person, so this was just when I liked to work. Around 11 p.m., I picked up a lady from a bar and drove 35 minutes away to drop her off at home. It was pretty much at the edge of the city, in a much more secluded and quiet area. After that, another pickup request came through from somewhere 10 minutes away. I was reluctant to accept it because the drop-off location wasn't back towards the city, but instead further out. I still ended up accepting it and just hoped that the next person would be going towards the city, where there would likely be more work. I pulled onto the road and started driving to the pickup spot. The road to get there was through a bunch of farmland and not much else. It was pretty empty of any other cars too. Once I got to the last turn, it was down a thin dirt road going between a field of tall grass or wheat. At the end, I could see a farmhouse on top of a small hill. That was the location that the app said they were at. I pulled up and parked in the open grass just in front of the house. The lights were off, and nobody was outside. After a few seconds, I lightly honked to let them know I was here. I had my windows rolled down, and the crops blowing around in the wind were really loud. I only say that because a sudden tap on the passenger door startled me. I hadn't thought to look back at the road I just came from because I obviously assumed they would be coming from the house. The man leaned his head through the open window and looked at me. There was a strange moment as he held a straight face and said nothing before I spoke, asking if he was the one who ordered the Uber. His eyes moved to the back seat, looking around before he nodded and looked back at me. "Can you help me carry something out to the car?" he asked. Technically being at work, my reactive answer was, "Sure." Assuming it was just some luggage or something, I quickly regretted answering without thinking about it. He began walking towards the house, so I got out of the car and followed loosely behind him. Once he got up to the porch, he opened the door and somewhat rushed inside without even looking back at me. As I matched his pace and got onto the porch, the wide-open door showed an empty hallway with still no lights turned on, and the man was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't even hear any footsteps of him walking around. Standing there, an eerie feeling loomed over me. I was so scared, I didn't know what to think. I only heard a voice call out to me, "Come in." I was terrified. "Sir." I called out. The house remained quiet, with no response or movement from inside past the doorway. It quickly fell to nearly pitch black, and with it being eerily quiet, there was no way I was going in there. I turned and ran back to my car, then drove back through the field and down to the main road, canceling the Uber. My biggest regret from that night was not saying anything. I thought that since nothing happened, I had no good reason to notify the police. But every time I think back on it, there seems to be less of a chance that it wasn't something horrible. I even looked up some information on the farmhouse about a month after this happened, and all I could find was that it was last sold in the 1960s and a married couple were killed in that house. It seemed to be a very big deal at that time. The bodies were never found. So, the man I saw almost definitely wasn't the owner. He probably didn't even live there. What was waiting for me inside that house had I followed him in is something I'll never know for sure.